world's largest owner of commercial aircraft has never flown a single paying passenger. Most travelers have never heard its name, has no check-in counter at any airport on Earth, and there is a real chance the plane you last flew on was not actually owned by the airline painted on its tail. By the end of this video, you will understand why roughly half of the world's commercial aircraft fleet is not owned outright by the airlines flying them, how the company behind that arrangement actually makes its money, why the whole system nearly saved the airline industry during its worst year in history, and how one quiet company grew large enough to outown every airline on the planet without most people ever noticing. Start with the basic fact. Depending on which count you use, somewhere between 50 and 55% of commercial aircraft in service today are leased rather than purchased. That means when you board a flight, the seat, the wings, and the engines around you may legally belong not to the airline whose logo is on the fuselage, but to a completely separate finance company that most passengers have never heard of and will never interact with directly. This is not some small side arrangement affecting a handful of budget carriers either. It touches nearly every major airline on the planet, from full-service legacy carriers to low-cost operators, all of them mixing owned and leased aircraft within the very same fleet, often without a passenger ever being able to tell the difference from the jet bridge. Airlines are understandably not eager to advertise which of their planes are financed this way. The marketing is built entirely around the airline's own brand, its own safety record, its own service. But underneath that branding sits a layer of ownership that has almost nothing to do with any of it. A budget carrier and a flagship national airline can be flying the exact same physical aircraft, built on the same assembly line, financed through the exact same leasing company, wearing nothing in common but a different paint job. The plane itself, the actual hardware doing the flying, is often just a rented asset moving between whichever airline currently needs that specific model, in that specific configuration, for that specific stretch of years. It might spend its first lease term with one national carrier, get repainted and handed to a completely different airline on another continent for its second lease, and finish its working life somewhere else again, all while the physical airframe itself never changes hands in terms of who actually owns it. To understand why leasing exists at all, start with what buying actually costs. A new Airbus A320neo, the single-aisle workhorse behind most short and medium-haul routes, runs an airline somewhere around $110 million. A larger, longer-range Boeing 787 costs roughly $250 million. Those are list prices too, before financing costs, before spare parts inventories, before training crews on a new type, and before any of the ground infrastructure a new aircraft type might require. And airlines rarely buy just one. A single order to grow or refresh a fleet typically covers dozens of aircraft at once, which turns a single purchasing decision into a multi-billion-dollar commitment before a single ticket is sold on any of them. Most airlines either do not have that kind of cash sitting around, or would rather not tie it all up in hardware that depreciates the moment it leaves the factory. That gap between what an airline needs and what it can comfortably spend up front is exactly the space leasing was built to fill. So how does one of these deals actually get structured? There are actually two very different kinds of aircraft leases, and the distinction matters. A wet lease means the company providing the plane also provides the crew, the maintenance, and the insurance, essentially renting out a fully staffed operation by the hour, and those deals tend to run anywhere from 1 month to about 2 years. A dry lease is the one that matters for this story. In a dry lease, a finance company simply provides the aircraft itself, with no crew and no operations attached, and the airline flies it exactly as if it were their own for a fixed term before handing it back. Dry leases are the long game. A typical dry lease on a new single-aisle aircraft runs somewhere between 6 and 10 years, and can stretch up to 12 years for a larger twin-aisle widebody. For an Airbus A320neo, the monthly payment on one of these deals runs around $370,000. For a Boeing 787, it runs anywhere from $800,000 to $1.25 million a month, depending on the age of the aircraft and the specific terms of the deal. Spread across a lease term measured in years rather than months, that monthly number adds up to a lot less than the full purchase price sitting on the balance sheet all at once, which is the first and most obvious reason airlines find it attractive. Here is the part that surprises people. Add up every monthly payment across the full life of a leased aircraft, and it frequently costs an airline more in total than simply buying the same plane outright would have. If leasing were purely about raw arithmetic, it would often lose. So the real reason leasing dominates the industry has almost nothing to do with the sticker price, and everything to do with what it does to an airline's balance sheet and flexibility. Leasing keeps enormous debt off the airline's own books, which preserves cash and keeps the company more financially agile. It lowers the barrier to entering a new route or a new market, since an airline can add capacity without first raising the full purchase price in financing. And critically, a lease has a fixed end date, which means an airline can hand a plane back and pick up a newer. more efficient one instead of being stuck flying the same aging aircraft for 30 years because it already paid for it outright. This is exactly why so many of the fastest-growing low-cost airlines in the world lease the vast majority of their fleets rather than owning them. Growing quickly means adding dozens of aircraft in a short window, and no young airline wants to gamble its entire balance sheet on owning every single one of them outright, while it is still trying to prove the business model works. None of this comes free of downsides, though. Leasing shifts financial risk away from the airline, but it also means the airline is permanently paying rent on an asset it will never fully own, and never build equity in, the same basic trade-off as renting an apartment instead of buying a home. Lease agreements can also include strict conditions on how the aircraft must be maintained and returned, sometimes requiring expensive refurbishment right before handback, so the plane meets the lessor's condition standards, an unglamorous cost that rarely makes it into any airline's earnings call. And because a lessor is ultimately in the business of maximizing utilization across its entire portfolio, not any single airline's convenience, popular aircraft types can become harder to secure during boom periods, when every airline wants the same fuel-efficient models at once, sometimes leaving smaller or newer carriers waiting years for delivery slots that larger, more established customers of the lessor get to claim first. That flexibility is not theoretical. It became the difference between survival and collapse for parts of the industry during the pandemic. When passenger demand fell off a cliff almost overnight in 2020, airlines needed to shrink their fleets immediately to match a fraction of their normal traffic. An airline that owned its planes outright was stuck with them, still accumulating maintenance costs and depreciation on aircraft sitting idle on a runway with nowhere to fly. Airlines that leased a large share of their fleet had a release valve. Many simply returned leased aircraft to the lessors as terms came up or through negotiated early returns, shedding capacity in months instead of trying to sell owned aircraft into a market where almost nobody was buying. The lessors themselves absorbed a huge share of that shock instead, holding onto grounded aircraft, renegotiating payment schedules with struggling airlines, and waiting for demand to recover before placing those same jets with whichever carrier needed capacity once travel picked back up again. The crisis did not invent this advantage, but it made it visible to anyone paying attention. Leasing is not just a financing trick, it is a shock absorber built into the structure of the entire industry. And in 2020, that shock absorber is arguably what kept a number of airlines from going under entirely, by giving them a way to shrink fast enough to survive a collapse in demand nobody had budgeted for. So who actually is the company standing behind all of this? Which brings us back to that anonymous giant from the opening. The largest aircraft lessor in the world is a company called AerCap, and it did not get that size by accident, it bought its way there through two enormous deals. In 2014, AerCap acquired a rival lessor called ILFC from the insurance giant AIG for about $7.6 billion, instantly building a combined fleet of roughly 1,300 aircraft. That would have been a huge company on its own. Then in November of 2021, right as the industry was still climbing out of the pandemic, AerCap acquired GECAS, the aircraft leasing arm of General Electric, for approximately $30 billion, adding a large helicopter fleet and a major engine leasing business on top of its existing aircraft. After that deal, AerCap's total assets pushed past $70 billion. Today, AerCap owns or manages more than 3,500 aircraft, engines, and helicopters combined, with the aircraft alone numbering around 1,681, plus roughly 300 helicopters and over 1,200 engines, keeping the vast majority of that fleet leased out and flying at any given time. No airline on Earth owns more flying hardware than that. AerCap is not alone at the top either. Alongside two other major players, SMBC Aviation Capital and Aviation, the three largest lessors together control close to 30% of the entire global commercial aircraft fleet. In other words, a small handful of finance companies that never sell a ticket or board a single passenger collectively hold more aviation hardware than almost every airline brand you could name combined. None of this is slowing down. As airlines keep chasing newer, more fuel-efficient aircraft to cut operating costs and emissions, leasing gives them a faster way to cycle older jets out and next-generation ones in without waiting for a decade of depreciation schedules to run their course first. That constant churn is exactly what keeps lessors like AerCap in business, buying aircraft in bulk directly from manufacturers, sometimes placing orders for dozens of jets years before they are even built, leasing them out for years at a time, taking them back, and leasing them again to someone else, sometimes for the entire useful life of the airframe, decades after the original deal was signed. Consolidation is likely to keep going too. When the biggest lessors merge or acquire smaller rivals, as AerCap did twice, the surviving companies get access to more airlines, more aircraft types, and more negotiating leverage with manufacturers ordering in bulk, which tends to squeeze out smaller, independent lessors over time. The result is a financial layer sitting quietly underneath the entire commercial aviation industry, one most travelers never think about because it was never designed for passengers to notice in the first place, run by a small number of companies whose names never appear on a boarding pass. So the next time you settle into a window seat and glance at the airline's logo near the door, remember that the logo tells you who is flying the plane, not necessarily who owns it. Behind roughly half of the aircraft in the sky sits a finance company you have probably never heard of, one that may own more aircraft than every airline you can name combined, quietly making money from that flight in the background, without ever selling you a ticket, checking your bag, or appearing anywhere on your boarding pass.